My dear brothers and sisters, when we hear the name Mark Twain, we usually think of books like Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. But Mark Twain wrote another book called The Prince and the Pauper. In some ways, The Prince and the Pauper is a more important book than Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn. This book concerns two boys who were born in England. The first boy was born to the royal family and was the direct heir to the throne of England. He was the eldest son of Queen Victoria. He was given the title Prince of Wales. Eventually he became King Edward VI. Commenting on his birth, Mark Twain says, England had so longed for him and hoped for him and prayed to God for him. And now that he had really come, the people went nearly mad with joy. Everybody took a holiday, and rich and low, poor and rich, feasted and danced and sang. On the very same day that the prince was born to the royal family, another boy was born to a poor family in the slums of London. He was given the name Tom Canty, and eventually he became a beggar boy, a waif, a rogue on the streets. Commenting on his birth, Mark Twain says, he was an unwanted boy. Nobody longed for him. Nobody hoped for him. Nobody prayed to God for him. And now that he had come into the world, nobody feasted. Nobody danced. Nobody sang. Both boys grew up in very different surroundings. Both grew up with totally different views of the world. One thing about them was the same. They had the same kind of spirit of adventure and enthusiasm that you find in all boys on the verge of becoming adolescents. One day, Tom Canty found himself outside the gates of the royal palace. He was awestruck with its beauty. As he edged closer to the gates to get a better look, the guards charged him and brutally threw him to the ground. The young prince happened to see this incident, and he came running to Tom's defense. To the consternation of the guards, the prince invited Tom into the palace to see his royal quarters. Well, Tom was absolutely flabbergasted. He had never seen anything like this before. And the prince was charmed by the spontaneity and genuineness of his new friend. And then something unusual happened. As the prince was showing Tom the huge mirror in his room, the two boys could not believe what they saw in the mirror. Except for Tom's rags and dirty face, he was a perfect look-alike for the prince. They could pass for identical twins. And then they both got the same idea. Wouldn't it be fun to switch places and play a trick on everybody? So the prince put on Tom's beggar clothes and wandered off through the slums of London and rubbed elbows with the poor and the exploited. Meanwhile, Tom put on the prince's clothes and rubbed elbows with the rich and the famous. After a while, both boys got kind of tired of the game, and the prince returned to the palace, tried to enter it, but the guards seized him. When he refused to go away, they threw him into the palace prison. No amount of persuasion would convince them that he was the Prince of Wales. To make a long story short, eventually the situation got ironed out. But something important happened in the process. As a result of his experience, the prince learned firsthand what it meant to be poor, what it meant to be treated badly, what it meant to be oppressed unfairly by those in authority. The prince eventually became king and was one of the most merciful and best-loved kings ever to reign on the throne of England because of his experience. After having changed places with the pauper. He walked as a pauper for a while and never forgot that experience. Now, that story of the prince and the pauper is not unlike the story of Jesus Christ and each one of us. We are the beggar boy, and Jesus is the prince, destined to become the king of all creation. Jesus switched places with us. He exchanged the royal robes of his divinity for the dirty rags of our humanity. And like the prince in Mark Twain's story, Jesus learned firsthand what it is like to rub elbows with the poor and with the downtrodden. Unlike the prince in the Mark Twain story, Jesus did something infinitely more. He died at the hands of his own subjects, rose from the dead, and now reigns as the King of heaven and earth. And that's the great mystery we celebrate today on this feast of Christ the King. We celebrate the fact that Jesus, the King of heaven and earth, understands our situation. He became one of us and experienced firsthand what we experience. He did more. He suffered and died for us. At about the same time that Mark Twain was writing his story about events in London, events were taking place in Washington. Abraham Lincoln was the president. On Good Friday in April 1865, he was assassinated. And his body was placed on a funeral train that made it, I'd say, a dozen stops. It went from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, where he was eventually buried. But on the way, it stopped at major cities. Buffalo was one of them, so that people, as many people as possible, could get an opportunity to pay their reverence and respect to the assassinated presidents. And I think it was in Cleveland, Ohio, a black woman was waiting with her son, and when they finally got to the president's body, the poor lady lifted her son up and said, "Honey, take a long look. That man died for you." On Good Friday, Jesus also died. He was not the president of our nation. He was the King of heaven and earth. And what the black lady said to her little son, I say to you, as I point to this crucifix, honey, take a long look. That man died for you. And so it's appropriate to ask ourselves, well, first of all, to reflect on that fact, which we do, but I don't know if we do it enough. To reflect on the fact that he gave his life that we might live eternally. And if that's the case, we ought to ask ourselves, what am I doing for him? What am I doing for him? Especially when he comes in disguise. Are my eyes opened so that I can recognize him in the hungry, in the thirsty, in the imprisoned, in the sick, all those people that he talks about in this gospel passage today? Jesus is a master of disguises. You remember the song, I think it's from Camelot, I wonder what the king is doing to you tonight. Do you remember that song? It was a nice, wonderful, wonderful song. Yeah. Do you wonder what the king is doing today? The king is hungry. The king is thirsty. The king is a stranger away from home. The king is an immigrant. The king is at the city mission because he has no home. The king is in prison. I'll close with these words of Jesus. Whatever you did for any of the least of my brethren, you did for me. Amen.